The sterile click of the mouse echoes in the cavernous silence of the penthouse office, a sound swallowed by the city lights sprawling below like a venomous map. My finger hovers over the final button. Execute. The word hangs in the air, heavy, absolute. Outside, the wind whispers secrets against the glass, stories of power and fall, whispers that used to chill me, but now sound like a mournful lullaby. This single action, clicking this button, untangles years of threads, years of quiet work and colder silence. It unravels him.
It reclaims me.
The air in the room feels thin, charged, anticipation thrumming like a live wire. My stomach is a knot of ice and fire. This is it. The final breath before the plunge. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me more than you know. We built this life on glass. Sparkling, impressive, reflecting everything beautifully. On the surface, it shimmered. A penthouse view, the right car, the dinners where conversations were curated performances, the easy laughter that never quite reached the eyes. He was the architect of this glass palace, the self-made man, the one with the title, the corner office, the public face of success. I was. The foundation? The decorative element? It was never quite clear, even to me. My days were full, a different kind of full. Managing the properties he barely saw, overseeing the investments he signed off on without a second glance, curating a home that felt less like a sanctuary and more like a showroom. There were committees, charities, the endless logistics of maintaining the facade. I moved through it all, with quiet efficiency, a ghost in gilded cages. I read, I learned, I managed our complex financial landscape with a meticulousness he never possessed, or perhaps never bothered to apply to the household matters. He called it playing house, I called it administration. It was the first subtle erosion, the way he framed my existence through the lens of his own. My work was at work because it didn't have a corporate letterhead. The words, when they finally came, weren't a surprise, not really. More like the confirmation of a suspicion that had been growing, a weed through the cracks in the glass. We were at some industry dinner, the air thick with the smell of money and ambition. Someone, a peer of his, asked me what I did. I started to explain, hesitantly, about managing our portfolio, about the complex restructuring of the family trust I'd just completed, saving us a significant amount. He cut across me, a laugh too loud, too jovial, silencing the table. Oh, Alice? Alice doesn't really do anything, he boomed, his arm thrown carelessly around my shoulder, a gesture of possession, not affection. His eyes, when they met mine, held a kind of indulgent pity, laced with something colder I didn't fully grasp until later. She's my wife. Keeps the home front tidy, you know. My little domestic engineer, he chuckled, and the others chuckled with him, their eyes sliding over me, dismissing me. The phrase no career wasn't used that night, not explicitly. But the meaning hung heavy in the air, suffocating. You're not a professional. You are not serious. You are decorative. It was like being slapped, but the sting was internal, deep in the bone. I smiled, a tight, brittle thing, and excused myself to the powder room. I remember looking at myself in the ornate mirror, the reflection a stranger, in an expensive dress. Who was this woman? Was this all I was? A domestic engineer in a glass palace? The heat rose in my chest, not of embarrassment, but of something else. Something hard. That night, in the cold silence of our bedroom, the resentment settled. It wasn't just the words. It was the casual cruelty, the public humiliation, the utter lack of respect for my intelligence, for the quiet, complex work I did do, even if it wasn't for a salary on paper. It wasn't about needing his validation. It was about the fundamental inequality, the way he saw me as an extension of his lifestyle, not an individual with her own capabilities, her own mind. The glass palace felt less like a home and more like a prison. The morning after, the air between us was strained. He acted as if nothing had happened, whistling as he tied his tie, oblivious to the earthquake he'd triggered within me. I watched him, a knot forming in my stomach. This couldn't stand. I couldn't stand this. The thought wasn't about revenge yet, not quite. It was about survival. About reclaiming myself. About proving him wrong. Not to him, but to the woman in the mirror. My initial reaction was a quiet, almost imperceptible shift. I started spending more time in my study, the room he considered my hobby space. I wasn't just managing our existing assets anymore. I was researching. Deep dives into sectors I'd only touched on, late nights poring over financial statements, annual reports, market trends. The language was familiar from managing our portfolio, but the context was different. This wasn't passive investment. This was active participation. This was power. I needed capital, significant capital, more than I could access without his knowledge through our joint accounts or the family trust he technically controlled, even if I managed it. I began liquidating personal assets he barely remembered I owned, a small inheritance from my grandmother, a collection of rare books I'd built over years, a piece of art I'd purchased myself before we met. It felt like selling off pieces of my past to build a future he couldn't see. Each transaction was small, discreet, easily masked within the larger movements of our wealth. The bank statements I reviewed were complex. Hiding a few smaller wire transfers within dozens of legitimate transactions was surprisingly easy. He never looked closely anyway. He signed whatever I put in front of him for the household accounts. My own accounts, the ones I'd maintained since before our marriage, those were mine alone. The first real step, the one that felt like crossing a line into a different country, was contacting a corporate lawyer. Not our family lawyer, who was deep in his pocket, but someone new, someone recommended by an old university friend I hadn't spoken to in years, someone discreet, sharp, and utterly ruthless. We met in anonymous coffee shops, in sterile conference rooms in buildings far from his office. I didn't tell her everything at first, just that I was interested in exploring strategic investments, potentially significant ones, in specific markets. I used burner phones for our early calls, a precaution that felt dramatic but necessary. The secrecy was paramount. If he got even a whiff of what I was planning, he would crush it, and me, without a second thought. The research intensified. I didn't just look at industries, I looked at companies. Companies in sectors he was weak in, companies that could potentially disrupt his own. And then, the idea, a slow burn at first, then a consuming fire. Not just to build something of my own, but to target him. Not his personal fortune, but his company. The source of his arrogance, the pedestal he stood on. What if I could touch that? It started as a wild thought, something too big, too impossible. But the more I researched, the more I saw the cracks. His company, built on his larger-than-life ego and aggressive expansion, was leveraged. He ran a tight ship, outwardly, but I knew his habits, his impulsiveness, his blind spots. He was so focused on the big, flashy deals, he ignored the quiet vulnerabilities. He micromanaged outwards but neglected the internal structures. A hostile takeover was too loud, too fast, too public. But a silent acquisition, building a significant stake piece by piece, through shell corporations, through various investment vehicles under different names, names of entities rather than people, that was a ghost in the machine. The complexity was staggering. It wasn't just about buying shares. It was about navigating layers of corporate law, setting up offshore entities, managing a network of lawyers, brokers, and financial advisors who couldn't know the full picture, only their small piece of the puzzle. I had to become a master of misdirection, a conductor of a hidden orchestra. Each step required careful planning, meticulous execution, and absolute secrecy. I learned to speak the language of shell corporations, of beneficial ownership, of proxy fights and tender offers. It was a cold, clinical language, devoid of emotion, which suited my state of mind perfectly. My emotions were locked down, channeled into relentless focus. Meanwhile, life at home continued its performance. I still hosted the dinners, chose the art, listened to him boast about his deals. I smiled, nodded, played the part of the supportive, uninvolved wife. It was a constant act, a tightrope walk between the woman he thought he knew and the woman I was becoming, silently in the shadows. The irony was sharp, a constant, bitter taste. He would come home, tired from a day of important work, and I would be there, the domestic engineer, having just finished structuring a multi-million-dollar offshore acquisition vehicle while he was picking out a new tie. The first significant challenge was funding. My liquidated personal assets weren't enough for the scale of what I was contemplating. I needed to secure external financing without raising red flags. Lenders would want to know the purpose, the collateral, the ultimate beneficiary. This is where the network came in. My lawyer connected me with a shadowy world of private equity, of funds that operated with discretion, asking fewer questions, for a higher price. It meant leveraging assets he did know about, but doing it in a way that he wouldn't connect to my activities. I restructured loans on properties, using complex financial instruments I'd only read about before. It was risky. If any piece of it unraveled prematurely, I could lose everything, including the normal life I was planning to dismantle. The pressure was immense. Sleep became a luxury. My days were split between performing wifely duties and operating in a hidden world of high finance. I felt like a spy in my own home. Every conversation was a potential minefield. Every shared meal, every casual question about my day, felt like an interrogation. I perfected the art of bland answers, of deflecting curiosity with practiced ease. Oh, just errands, or spent the day organizing the estate documents, things that were technically true but hid the larger truth. The project grew. What started as an idea to build something for myself, to gain independence, mutated into a targeted strategy. His company, his precious creation, became the focus. Not out of simple revenge, but because it was the single largest concentration of his power, his ego, his identity. To control it, to dismantle it if necessary, was the most direct path to severing myself from his influence entirely. It was a perverse form of liberation. His mockery continued, sometimes subtle, sometimes overt. He'd make jokes in front of friends about how I wouldn't understand the complexities of his business, or how my little projects were sweet but not quite real-world. Each comment, each dismissive wave of his hand, poured fuel on the fire. It wasn't just about acquiring his company anymore. It was about confronting the fundamental disrespect, the patriarchal assumption of his own superiority. His words were weapons he didn't know he was firing, and I was building armor in the shadows. The plan hit its first major snag about a year in. A key investor I'd been courting, a large, anonymous fund critical to the final push for capital, suddenly pulled back. No explanation, just silence. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced my carefully constructed calm. Had I been discovered? Had word leaked? I spent agonizing days trying to figure out what went wrong. Was it something I said? Something I did? Had his network, vast and powerful, caught wind of the scent? My lawyer, stone-faced and professional, couldn't get a clear answer either. The silence was deafening. I was bleeding money, running on borrowed time, and dwindling resources. Doubt crept in, a venomous whisper. Was I out of my depth? Was he right? Was I just playing a child's game in the grown-up world of finance? The glass palace walls felt like they were closing in. This setback forced a brutal reevaluation. I couldn't rely on traditional, or even semi-traditional, financing anymore. I needed a different approach, something more aggressive. I doubled down on the research, not just into his company's financial structure, but into its vulnerabilities, its secrets. Every disgruntled former employee, every failed project, every whisper of internal conflict. I started digging for dirt. Not just financial leverage, but informational leverage. This shift changed the nature of the operation. It moved from a purely financial play to something colder, more strategic, more personal. I wasn't just acquiring assets. I was gathering intelligence. I hired private investigators, ostensibly for security reviews of our properties, a cover story that was easy to sell. Their real work was elsewhere, following leads, verifying rumors, building profiles of key players in his company, identifying weaknesses in their operations, potential compliance issues, anything that could be used. The marriage, meanwhile, was a shell. We shared a home, a name, a history, but we were strangers living parallel lives. His arrogance had become unbearable, amplified by what I now saw as his fundamental shallowness. He talked endlessly about himself, his deals, his genius. My contributions, my thoughts, my life, were invisible to him. I learned to become truly invisible, to blend into the background of his life, using his inattention as my greatest asset. The woman he ignored was the one meticulously planning his downfall. The dry humor emerged here, the absurdity of his oblivious pontificating while I was mentally reviewing offshore holding structures during dinner. The deeper I got, the more I saw not just his hubris, but the rot beneath the surface of his success. Dubious accounting practices, corners cut on compliance, treatment of employees that bordered on abusive. The polished facade of his company had cracks I could now exploit. This wasn't just business anymore. There was a moral dimension, however twisted my own path had become. He wasn't just dismissive of me. He was building his empire on shaky ground, using methods that wouldn't withstand scrutiny. This realization was the midpoint shift. It wasn't just about proving him wrong or gaining independence. It became about dismantling something that was fundamentally unsound, built on ego and exploitation. My strategy shifted again. It wasn't purely an acquisition for control. It was an acquisition to expose. The financial play merged with the informational one. The goal wasn't just to own the company. It was to reveal its rotten core, to bring down the glass palace he was so proud of, piece by glittering, fragile piece. The financial crisis deepened. The failed investor meant I had to secure smaller, more expensive tranches of funding from multiple sources, adding layers of complexity and risk. The legal fees mounted. The investigators required hefty retainers. I was pouring every available resource, every ounce of my energy, into this clandestine war. There were nights I stared at spreadsheets until dawn, my eyes burning, my mind numb, wondering if I was building something or simply digging my own grave. His behavior only made it easier and harder. Easier because his blind spots were so obvious. He never suspected, never once. Harder because living the lie, day in and day out, was emotionally exhausting. The pretense of a normal marriage felt like a heavy cloak, suffocating me. There were moments, brief flashes, where I questioned everything. Was this worth it? This cold, lonely path? This descent into the shadows? Then he would say something, another casually cruel dismissal, another boast about his superiority, and the cold resolve would flood back in, harder than before. There was no turning back. The bridges were burned. The path forward was the only one left. I was too deep in, too invested, emotionally and financially. The turning point wasn't a sudden revelation, but a hardening, a final shedding of doubt. I wasn't just building a defense. I was launching an offensive. The ghost was preparing to strike. I secured the final pieces of funding, a complex web of loans and private investments structured through layers of blind trusts. The acquisition strategy was refined, a series of rapid-fire purchases of key blocks of shares through various entities designed to avoid triggering reporting thresholds until the last possible moment, followed by a final tender offer that would happen too fast for him to counter. It was a precision strike, years in the making, compressed into weeks of intense, hidden activity. The days leading up to the final phase were a blur of frantic, silent action. Instructions whispered down encrypted lines, documents exchanged in secure digital dead drops, sleepless nights monitoring market movements. At home, I maintained the facade. Dinner was on the table, laundry was done, social obligations were met. He was oblivious, complaining about minor issues at his company, never seeing the tidal wave building on the horizon. The climax wasn't a single explosion, but a series of shockwaves. The rapid acquisition began. My legal team initiated the final tender offer. The news broke, not with my name attached initially, but with the names of the shell corporations, the investment funds. The market reacted instantly. His company's stock, which had been stable, began to wobble. Then plunge. I remember the moment he found out, or the first piece of it. He was on a call in his study, his voice rising, laced with panic. I was in the living room, pretending to read. I heard phrases, hostile bid, Who the hell is name of one of my shell entities? His face, when he came out, was pale, etched with confusion and fear. He wasn't arrogant anymore. He was just lost. Something's happening, he mumbled, more to himself than to me. Someone's attacking the company. He worked frantically, calls to his board, his lawyers. They couldn't figure it out. The ownership structure was too opaque, the attackers too hidden. The puzzle pieces didn't fit for them. But I held the box. The real reveal, the plot twist that blindsided him completely, came a day later. My legal team, as part of the tender offer documentation, was required to disclose the beneficial owner if it was a single entity controlling the various vehicles. The carefully constructed anonymity began to crumble, by design. My name, attached to the primary holding company, started to surface in financial reports, in regulatory filings. I wasn't in the room when he found out. I was across town in my lawyer's office, watching it unfold on a screen. The news tickers flashing red. The headlines. His company's name, followed by words like hostile takeover, unraveling, collapse, and then, subtly at first, my name. Alice Dubois. The wife. The domestic engineer, the one with no career. His calls started then. My phone, the main one, rang incessantly. I didn't answer. My lawyer advised against any direct contact. Let the professionals handle it, she said. But I needed to see it. I needed to see him. I drove back to the penthouse. The city lights were still sprawling, but they looked different now. Less like a venomous map, more like conquered territory. The elevator ride-up felt like an ascent into a different atmosphere. I opened the door. He was standing in the living room, surrounded by crumpled papers, his face a mask of disbelief, rage, and utter humiliation. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something raw and ugly. He looked up as I entered, his eyes wide, uncomprehending. Alice, he whispered, the name a question and accusation. What? What is this? What did you do? I stood there, silent for a moment, the quiet power settling over me like a heavy cloak. I looked at the room, the expensive furniture, the art, the view. The glass palace, now fragile, exposed. I acquired your company, I said, my voice calm, steady, devoid of emotion. Piece by piece. Silently. His mouth opened and closed, no sound coming out. He looked at the papers in his hand, then back at me, as if seeing me for the first time. You don't have a career, he stammered, the old dismissal rising instinctively, even now. You don't know. You can't. A cold smile touched my lips. I learned, I said. While you were busy telling everyone I did nothing. I learned how to manage assets, how to structure deals, how to find the weaknesses in a leveraged company built on hot air and ego. I learned how to be invisible and how to strike from the shadows you never thought to look in. He lunged towards me, a choked sound of rage, but stopped short. He saw something in my eyes, perhaps. Not just anger, but a complete lack of fear, a steely resolve he'd never seen before. He saw the architect of his ruin standing calmly in his living room. The collapse was swift, brutal. The news spread like wildfire. The irony was too delicious for the media to resist. The powerful CEO brought down by the little woman he dismissed. My name was everywhere. The company, already vulnerable, couldn't withstand the shock, the loss of confidence, the exposure of some of the less than savory practices my investigation had uncovered and which were now leaking out. It didn't just get acquired. It imploded. He was blindsided, publicly ruined, not by a rival, but by the ghost he lived with. The aftermath is quiet, different. The glass palace is empty now. The divorce was swift, surprisingly uncomplicated given the financial earthquake. He was too broken, too humiliated, to fight effectively. My team handled everything. I emerged with my independence, my own considerable fortune, and control over the assets I'd quietly amassed. The feeling isn't triumph, not purely. There's a cold satisfaction, certainly. A sense of vindication that goes bone deep. But there's also a hollowness, a quiet sadness for the life that was, or the life I thought might be. The betrayal cut deep, and while I turned the blade, the wound was originally inflicted on me. I stand now, on the precipice of a new life, one I built myself, in secret, from the ground up. I have a career now, a real one, built on skill, strategy, and resilience. The world of finance that seemed cold and impersonal became my battleground, and I learned to wield its weapons. Sometimes, late at night, I think about him, where he is, what he's doing. The man who looked down on me, who defined my worth by his own limited vision. He taught me a valuable lesson inadvertently. He taught me that underestimation can be the most powerful camouflage. He taught me that the quiet ones are often the ones building empires while the loud ones are busy boasting. I don't need to tell anyone what I do anymore. The world knows. And the knowledge that I built this from nothing, fueled by dismissal and disrespect, is a quiet strength I carry within me. The glass palace shattered, but I built my own foundation beneath the ruins, solid and real. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these to life.